December 1944. The air in the Ardennes is not breathed. It is bitten. It is a cold that pierces deeper than bone, a physical presence clinging to the sodden wool of uniforms and turning a rifle's metal into a block of ice, painful to the touch. For the men of the 101st Airborne Division, the world has shrunk to the confines of a frozen foxhole, dug into the unforgiving earth surrounding the small Belgian town of Bastogne. Every dawn, if the grim transition from black to leaden gray can be called, that brings the same routine. Hunger, a dull, constant knot in the stomach. Rations are a distant memory. Now, a handful of melted snow and perhaps a hard biscuit is a feast. The cold is the silent enemy, as lethal as the one in field gray. Toes turn numb, hands crack and bleed inside thin gloves, and the simple act of standing still is an invitation to frostbite. From his hole on the perimeter, a young soldier from Ohio watches the forest. The trees, skeletal and coated in frost, look like an army of ghosts. Every snap of a branch, every whisper of the wind is a potential attack. The silence is almost worse than the shelling. The silence is thick with tension, with the anticipation of death arriving as a mortar shell or the sudden chatter of an MG-42. The wounded are the worst part. The main field hospital was captured in the first days, along with most medical supplies. Now, a bombed-out church serves as an aid station. Men lie on the stone floor, covered with whatever can be found. A single doctor, his eyes hollowed by exhaustion, moves among them, making impossible choices. Morphine is gone. Bandages are reused. The smell of antiseptic and gangrene mingles with that of stale incense, a macabre testament to desecrated sanctity. Bastogne is no longer a town. It is a target, a smoking crater encircled by a ring of German steel. The men of the 101st, the Screaming Eagles, alongside fragments of an armored division and artillery battalions, are an island of resistance in an ocean of panzer power. They are completely surrounded. The outside world has vanished, replaced by the near-constant whistle of incoming artillery and the echo of tank treads moving in the dark. The feeling of isolation is absolute. There is no news, no reinforcement, no tangible hope. There is only the order to hold. Hold this vital crossroads, this nexus of 7 roads the enemy desperately needs to feed its offensive. But with every passing hour, ammunition dwindles, food runs out, and the number of men able to hold a rifle shrinks. Morale, that fragile barrier against panic, is cracking under the unbearable weight of the siege. In the foxholes around Bastogne, the men do not fight for victory. They fight for the next breath of frigid air, for the next gray dawn. They are on the edge of the abyss, staring annihilation in the face. To understand the steel vice closing on Bastogne, one must look beyond the snow-covered forests, to the war map spread out in Adolf Hitler's bunker. There, Operation Wacht am Rhein, a watch on the Rhine, was not a desperate battle but a stroke of genius conceived to change the course of the war. The plan was audacious to the point of madness, a massive surprise attack through the most weakly defended sector of the Allied front, the Ardennes. The ultimate objective was the port of Antwerp. If the panzer armies could smash through the Ardennes, cross the Meuse River, and capture that vital port, they would sever the Allied armies in two. British and Canadian forces in the north would be cut off from the American armies in the south. It would be a logistical and psychological disaster from which Hitler believed the Allies could not recover. It would force a negotiated peace on the Western Front, allowing the Reich to turn its full fury upon the Soviet Union. And at the heart of this bold plan, like a spider in the center of its web, lay Bastogne. It was not a fortress, nor a great industrial city. Its value was purely geographical. 7 major roads, the only ones capable of supporting the weight and volume of a winter armored offensive, converged on its central square. Without Bastogne, the German tank columns would be forced onto muddy, treacherous secondary roads, slowing their advance to a crawl. Bastogne was not an objective. It was the key that unlocked the door to Antwerp. Commanding the armored spearhead tasked with taking this key was General der Panzertruppe Heinrich Freiherr von Luttwitz, a man cast in the mold of the old Prussian military aristocracy. A decorated tank commander, a horseman who had competed in the Olympics, Luttwitz was the embodiment of German military confidence and tradition. He saw war as a science, an equation of force and speed. From his command post, as his panzer divisions encircled the town, Luttwitz analyzed the situation with cold, dispassionate logic. The defenders were paratroopers, light infantry without heavy armor support. They were outnumbered, at least 5 to 1. They were completely surrounded with no possibility of resupply by land. Their supplies, he calculated, must be perilously low. The weather prevented any enemy air support. The equation was simple. Surrender was inevitable. In his mind, there was no room for doubt. Resistance was futile, a senseless sacrifice of life that would only delay his tight schedule. He fundamentally underestimated his opponent. He did not see an elite unit forged in the fires of Normandy and Holland. He saw figures on a map. He ignored the human factor, the psychology of a soldier who has jumped behind enemy lines and considers a desperate fight his natural state. For Luttwitz, the ultimatum he was about to send was not a gamble, but a mere formality, an act of professional courtesy before the final coup de grace. The morning of December 22nd arrived cold and quiet. The artillery had fallen silent, an ominous hush that frayed the nerves more than the bombardment itself. It was then that the sentries of F Company, 327th Glider Infantry Regiment, saw movement. 4 figures emerged from the freezing fog, walking slowly toward the American lines. One of them carried a makeshift white flag. The news raced via field telephone to the divisional headquarters, a damp, cold cellar in the center of Bastogne. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, acting commander of the 101st, was asleep for the first time in nearly 2 days. He was woken abruptly. "General, some Germans have come forward with a white flag." McAuliffe, a pragmatic and plain-spoken artillery officer, pulled on his boots and went down to his command post. The 2 German officers, a major and a lieutenant, were led blindfolded to the entrance. They were not allowed inside. An American intelligence officer received the envelope they carried. It was a formal ultimatum, typewritten in both English and German. The text was a model of Teutonic arrogance. It demanded the honorable surrender of the encircled town. It spoke of the massive concentration of artillery ready to annihilate the American forces and the civilian population of Bastogne if the offer was rejected. It gave a 2-hour deadline. When the message was read to him, McAuliffe's first reaction was not fear or deliberation. It was disbelief. A short, dry laugh escaped him. "Us surrender? Aw, nuts." To him, the idea was so ludicrous it didn't even merit serious consideration. He crumpled the paper in his hand and tossed it in a corner. Surrender was not in his vocabulary. His staff, however, were more mindful of protocol. They insisted that a formal reply must be sent. War, even at its most brutal, had its rules. They sat around a makeshift table, trying to draft a text that would convey their defiance. Long, flowery phrases about honor and duty were proposed. None seemed right. None captured the spirit of the 101st. It was then that Lieutenant Colonel Harry Kinnard, the division's operations officer, spoke up. "General, that first remark of yours would be hard to beat." Another officer, remembering the spontaneous exclamation, added, "You said nuts!" A smile spread across the tired faces in the room. The idea caught on instantly. It was perfect. It was defiant. It was American. It was a direct jab at the pomposity of the German ultimatum. McAuliffe nodded, his decision made. He took a blank sheet of paper and wrote the official reply that would become legendary. It was not a paragraph, not even a full sentence. It was a single word. To the German commander, nuts, the American commander. The note was handed to the bewildered German officers. They did not understand the slang. "What does nuts mean?" they asked. Colonel Joseph Harper, the American officer who delivered the message, leaned in and gave them the translation. "In plain English," he said, "it means go to hell." In that cellar, with that single word, the battle for Bastogne became a legend. The reply was a spit in the eye of the German High Command. That very night, the Luftwaffe unleashed its fury on Bastogne. Waves of bombers appeared in the night sky, their engines a sinister drone that preceded devastation. The already battered town was rocked by explosions that turned buildings into torches and streets into craters. The makeshift hospital was hit, killing nurses and wounded soldiers alike. It was punishment for their insolence. The days following the famous reply became an uninterrupted hell. Luttwitz, enraged by the humiliation, ordered his divisions to crush the perimeter. The Germans launched constant probing attacks, testing every sector, searching for a weakness. To the east, infantry from the 26th Volksgrenadier Division charged in human waves against the foxholes of the 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment, only to be scythed down by machine gun fire and accurate artillery strikes. But the real test came on December 23rd. A miracle happened. After nearly a week of gray skies and thick fog, the weather broke. The sun, pale and watery, fought its way through the clouds. For the men on the ground, it was a heavenly sight. For the Allied High Command, it was the chance they had been waiting for. Within hours, the sky filled with the roar of hundreds of engines. They were C-47 Skytrains, the transport planes, flying low and slow over the besieged town. From their open bays, rained colored parachutes. They carried everything the defenders desperately needed: ammunition, K-rations, blood plasma, batteries for the radios, bandages. 144 tons of hope fell from the sky on that first day. One soldier, seeing a container full of artillery shells, knelt and kissed it. Morale soared. They were no longer alone. This resupply changed the rules of the game. McAuliffe's artillery, which had been rationing every shell, could now answer every German attack in full force. Bazooka teams had fresh rounds to hunt panzers. Medics had plasma to save lives. The Germans, who had counted on the Americans, resources being exhausted, watched their advantage vanish into a sky full of parachutes. On Christmas Eve, the Germans launched their fiercest attack. The Panzer Lehr Division, one of the Army's elite units, focused its assault on the northwest sector, near the village of Champs. A column of Panther tanks, their long cannons spitting fire, advanced across the snowy fields, supported by Panzer Grenadiers. The American perimeter began to buckle under the overwhelming pressure. That's when McAuliffe's mobile defense kicked in. Combat Command B of the 10th Armored Division, a fire brigade of Sherman tanks and M18 Hellcat tank destroyers, raced to the threatened sector. One Hellcat, nicknamed Firefly, hid in a copse of trees waiting. Its crew watched as a Panther advanced, confident. They waited until the last second. The Hellcat's 76mm cannon roared, and the high-velocity round tore into the Panther's side armor, turning the inside into an inferno. The ambush broke the attack's momentum. The fighting was brutal and at close quarters. In the village of Marvy to the southeast, paratroopers fought house to house against the 2nd Panzer Division. They used mines, grenades, and bazookas to stop the steel giants. A single Sherman, immobilized but its guns still operational, became a pillbox that blocked a crucial crossroads for hours, destroying 3 enemy tanks before it was finally silenced. Christmas Day brought the final assault. Lutwitz threw everything he had left in a desperate attempt to smash Bastogne before Patton's relief force could arrive. The main attack again focused on the west. 18 German tanks, followed by 2 infantry battalions, crashed against the lines of the 327th Glider Infantry. The line bent, but it did not break. Men scrambled from their foxholes to place explosive charges on tank treads. American artillery, perfectly coordinated by frontline observers, created a wall of steel and fire that shredded the German infantry. Formations. The German tactical error was fatal. Instead of a massive, coordinated, simultaneous attack on the entire 360-degree perimeter, which would have stretched the defenders to their limit, they attacked piecemeal. An assault in the west, then one in the east. This allowed McAuliffe to shift his meager armored and artillery reserves from one hot spot to another, plugging each breach just in time. By nightfall on Christmas Day, the last great German assault had spent itself, the fields. Around Bastogne were littered with the smoking wrecks of dozens of German tanks and armored vehicles. The screaming eagles had weathered the storm. The failure to take Bastogne became a cancer in the heart of Hitler's plan. Every day the American flag flew over the town was a day lost on the offensive's strict timetable. Lutwitz's X-Lieven Panzer Corps, the spearhead that should have already been crossing the Meuse, was bogged down in a bloody battle of attrition for a crossroads. The frustration in the German headquarters was palpable. The stubborn defense had a domino effect that rippled across the entire front. Elite units, like the 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, which were meant to exploit the breakthrough and race west, had to be diverted to reinforce the siege. The knot of Bastogne was choking German logistics. Supply columns jammed the few secondary roads, becoming easy targets for the Allied fighter bombers that now owned the clear skies. Psychologically, the impact was even greater. News of the nuts reply spread like wildfire over Allied radios. At a time when panic and confusion reigned, when it seemed the German war machine was unstoppable once more, the story of an encircled airborne division refusing to surrender became a rallying cry. It was proof that the German advance could be stopped. McAuliffe's defiance became the defiance of the entire Allied army. Meanwhile, farther south, another general was reading the reports from Bastogne with a mixture of admiration and urgency. General George S. Patton, commanding the U.S. Third Army, had been ordered to counterattack north to relieve the pressure in the Ardennes. What he did next was one of the greatest logistical feats of the war. In less than 72 hours, Patton pivoted 3 of his divisions, over 250,000 men and their equipment, 90 degrees, and hurled them north in the dead of winter. It was a monumental achievement of planning and execution, and it was made possible by the time the men of the 101st were buying. Every hour of resistance in Bastogne was another hour for Patton's tanks to grind up the icy roads, another hour for the rescue pincer to close on the German salient. The defense of Bastogne did not just stop a panzer corps, it threw the entire German offensive off balance. It forced the enemy to fight at a time and place not of their choosing, consuming fuel, ammunition, and most importantly, time. Luttwitz's arrogance had shattered against McAuliffe's resolve, and the cracks were beginning to show in the entire structure of Hitler's last great gamble. The day after Christmas, December 26th, the exhausted defenders of Bastogne heard a new sound in the distance. It was not the familiar roar of German panzers, but the rumble of Sherman tank engines. The vanguard of Patton's 4th Armored Division, after days of bitter fighting, had finally broken through the German lines. At 1650, a Sherman tank named Cobra King made contact with the paratroopers on the southern perimeter. The 7-day siege was over. Legend has it that when Patton's officers met McAuliffe, they offered their congratulations on the rescue. True to the indomitable spirit of their division, no member of the 101st ever admitted they needed rescuing. Their pride was as impenetrable as their defense. The battle for Bastogne would continue for weeks, but the turning point had passed. The final statistics told a story of sacrifice and valor. The 101st Airborne Division suffered over 2,500 casualties, including 3 941 killed, 1,691 wounded, and 516 missing. But they had inflicted far greater damage. They had stopped a panzer corps in its tracks and shattered the timetable of an entire offensive. For Germany, the Battle of the Bulge was a disaster from which it would never recover. The losses were catastrophic, exceeding 100,000 men killed, wounded, and captured. Hundreds of irreplaceable tanks and aircraft were lost. These were the Reich's last combat. Reserves spent on a desperate gamble that failed in large part because of the stand in one small Belgian town. The legacy of Bastogne transcends numbers and strategy. It became an undying symbol of resilience against overwhelming odds. It is the story of ordinary soldiers who, facing cold, hunger, and a superior enemy, found a strength within themselves they never knew they possessed. It is the story of a commander who, at the moment of maximum pressure, answered not with an elaborate speech, but with a single colloquial word of defiance that encapsulated the spirit of a nation. "Nuts!" entered the annals of military history, a reply so bold and unconventional it humiliated the rigid formality of the Nazi war machine. It proved that morale could be a weapon as powerful as artillery, and that the will to fight of a few men could halt the advance of entire armies. The defense of Bastogne didn't just save a crossroads, it helped save the future of Europe, writing one of the most glorious chapters in the history of the American soldier.